Chapter 1. The Night, the Sky. Opened. The summer of 1947 was different in New Mexico. Old-timers would tell you that the desert had a restless quality that year, like it was waiting for something to happen. The thunderstorms came more frequently, rolling across the vast landscape with unusual intensity. Lightning would dance across the horizon in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the sky itself was trying to communicate. Picture the high desert on a July evening. The air is thin and clean, carrying the scent of sage and creosote for miles. Above, the Milky Way spreads across the darkness like a river of light, so bright and clear that you can almost imagine reaching up and touching those distant suns. This is a place where heaven feels close, where the boundary between earth and space seems gossamer thin. It was in this magical landscape that William Mac Brazel made his living, tending sheep and cattle on a ranch 75 miles northwest of Roswell. Mac was a practical man, weathered by decades of desert sun and wind. He knew every sound the desert made, from the whisper of wind through mesquite to the distant cry of coyotes in the night. But on the evening of July 2nd, 1947, Mac heard something new. The storm that night was unlike any he'd experienced. The thunder didn't come in the usual rolling waves, but seemed to crack the sky like breaking glass. The lightning was different too, not the familiar blue-white forks he knew, but strange pulsing colors that painted the desert in shades of green and violet. Mac stood on his porch, watching the display with the fascination of a man who'd seen 1,000 desert storms, but never one quite like this. There was music in the air that night. A high harmonic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound made his teeth ache and his skin tingle, as if the very atmosphere had become electric. Around midnight, something streaked across the sky. At first, Mac thought it might be a meteor, but this object moved differently. It pulsed with internal light, shifting between colors like a soap bubble in sunlight. And it was descending, not burning up in the atmosphere, but coming down in a controlled descent that ended somewhere to the southeast of his ranch. The impact, when it came, wasn't the crash he expected. There was no explosion, no fire lighting up the desert, just a soft thud that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into the soles of his feet. Then silence returned to the desert, deeper and more complete than before. Mac waited on his porch for another hour, listening. But the night had swallowed whatever had fallen from the sky, and eventually he went inside to bed. Tomorrow would bring answers. It always did in the desert, where secrets don't stay buried long under the endless sun. When morning came, Mac went about his usual routine. Coffee on the stove, a quick check of the weather, then out to tend his animals. The storm had left the air clean and fresh, with that particular clarity that comes after rain in the desert. But as Mac made his rounds, he began to notice things that didn't belong. Scattered across a section of his property was debris. At first glance, it looked like the remains of some kind of aircraft, but as Mac got closer, he realized this wasn't like any plane wreckage he'd ever seen. The pieces were too clean, too perfect. They hadn't burned or twisted in a crash. They looked more like they'd been carefully disassembled and scattered by a gentle hand. The largest pieces were beams of some kind, perfectly straight and incredibly light. Mac could lift a 10-foot section with one hand, yet when he tried to break one over his knee, it wouldn't budge. The material felt warm to the touch, even in the cool morning air, and along their length ran symbols that looked almost like writing. But what kind of writing? The marks weren't carved or painted on the surface. They seemed to be part of the material itself, flowing along the beams like veins in a leaf. When Mac looked at them directly, they appeared one way. When he glanced at them from the corner of his eye, they seemed to shift and change. Then there was the metal foil, acres of it, scattered across the desert like silver rain. Mac picked up a large sheet and crumpled it in his hands, expecting it to stay wadded up the way aluminum foil would. Instead, the material smoothed itself out, returning to its original flat shape without a single wrinkle or crease. It was as if the metal remembered what it was supposed to look like. Mac spent the morning collecting samples of the strange debris, his wonder growing with each piece he examined. Some of the material looked like metal but felt like silk. Some appeared solid but seemed to have no weight at all. And everywhere, those mysterious symbols, flowing and organic, unlike any human writing he'd ever seen. The strangest pieces were small, geometric shapes that seemed to generate their own light. They weren't hot, didn't use any visible power source, but they glowed with a soft, steady radiance that reminded Mac of fireflies on a summer evening. When he cupped them in his hands, they would pulse gently, as if responding to his heartbeat. As the day wore on, Mac found himself drawn back to the debris field again and again. Each time he looked, he noticed details he'd missed before. The way the larger pieces seemed to have broken along perfect geometric lines. The way some of the metal changed color depending on the angle of the sunlight. The way the symbols seemed to tell a story, if only he could understand their language. By evening, Mac had filled his pickup truck with examples of the strange materials. He'd been careful to take only small pieces, leaving the larger debris where he'd found it. Something about the scattered remains demanded respect, as if they were the relics of something sacred. That night, Mac sat on his porch again, watching the stars and thinking about what he'd discovered. The desert stretched away in all directions, vast and empty under the night sky. But tonight, it didn't feel empty. Tonight it felt like a place where impossible things were possible, where the universe had touched down to leave a message for anyone brave enough to read it. The light-generating fragments sat on the table beside him, casting gentle shadows that danced in the evening breeze. Their glow was comforting, like candlelight, but softer. Mac found himself relaxing as he watched them pulse, their rhythm matching his breathing, then his heartbeat, then something deeper and slower that seemed to connect him to the vast cosmos overhead. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the desert silence. But tonight, even that familiar sound seemed different, charged with meaning. It was as if the entire desert was trying to tell him something, to explain the miracle that had fallen from the sky into his keeping. Mac closed his eyes and listened to the night sounds, feeling more connected to the universe than he ever had before. Whatever had crashed on his ranch, it wasn't just debris from some military experiment. It was something that had traveled impossible distances to arrive at this exact spot, at this exact moment in time. And somehow Mac Brazel, a simple rancher who'd never traveled more than 100 miles from the place he was born, had become the custodian of humanity's first gift from the stars. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the scent of rain and possibility. Above, the Milky Way turned slowly in its ancient dance, no longer a distant river of light, but a highway that led to infinite wonders. Tomorrow would bring decisions. Questions would need answers. Authorities would need to be notified. But tonight, Mac Brazel sat under the stars with pieces of another world scattered around his ranch, marveling at the beautiful impossibility of it all. The night sky had opened and let something through. Something that would change everything, if the world was ready to accept the gift it had been given. But ready or not, the future had arrived in the New Mexico desert, carried on the summer wind and left glowing softly in the darkness, waiting for morning to reveal its secrets to a world that had never imagined such wonders were possible. Chapter 2. The Discovery That Changed Everything. The morning sun painted the New Mexico desert in shades of gold and amber as Mac Brazel loaded his pickup truck with samples of the mysterious debris. Each piece he'd collected told a story that defied everything he thought he knew about the world. But today, he would take that story to town and see if anyone could help him understand what had fallen from the sky. The drive to Roswell normally took Mac about an hour and a half along dusty ranch roads that wound through the high desert landscape, but this morning felt different. The familiar journey seemed charged with significance, as if he was carrying more than just strange metal fragments in the back of his truck. Mac had wrapped the most unusual pieces in old horse blankets, not because they were fragile, but because they seemed to deserve that kind of care. The light-generating fragments pulsed gently through the fabric, creating a soft, rhythmic glow that reminded him of a sleeping child's breathing. As he drove, Mac found himself thinking about the night of the storm, the strange colors in the lightning, the musical humming in the air, the way the object had descended with such controlled grace. It hadn't been falling, he realized. It had been landing, The crash site looked more like a gentle scattering than the violent impact of an uncontrolled descent. But if it had been a controlled landing, why had the craft broken apart? And where were the occupants? Mac pulled his truck over to the side of the road and sat quietly for a moment, letting that thought settle. He'd been so focused on the amazing properties of the debris that he hadn't considered what might have been inside whatever had scattered across his ranch. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its vastness both comforting and slightly overwhelming. Somewhere out there might be beings from another world, perhaps injured, perhaps trying to repair their damaged vessel. The thought should have frightened him, but instead it filled him with a strange sense of responsibility. He was about to restart the engine when something caught his eye. In the distance, almost at the limit of his vision, something was moving across the desert floor. Not the familiar shapes of cattle or antelope, but something smaller, more deliberate in its movements. Mac reached for the binoculars he kept in the glove compartment and focused on the distant figures. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. They were humanoid, but clearly not human. Small figures, perhaps 4 feet tall, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost like dancing. Their skin appeared to have a slight metallic sheen that reflected the morning sunlight, and their heads were proportionally larger than any humans would be. But it wasn't their appearance that struck Mac most forcefully. It was their behavior. They moved with purpose, examining the desert floor as if searching for something. And occasionally, one would stop and seem to communicate with the others through gestures that were both alien and somehow beautiful. Mac watched, transfixed, as the beings continued their search across the desert landscape. They were looking for pieces of their craft, he realized. The debris scattered across his ranch was just part of a larger pattern of wreckage, and these survivors were trying to recover what they could. One of the beings suddenly stopped and turned in Mac's direction. Even at a distance of several miles, Mac had the unmistakable feeling that it was looking directly at him. The sensation was neither threatening nor frightening, but it was deeply unsettling in its intensity. For a long moment, rancher and alien regarded each other across the vast desert. Then the being raised what appeared to be a hand in a gesture that Mac somehow understood was a greeting. Without thinking, Mac raised his own hand in response. The being seemed to nod, then turned back to its companions. Within minutes, all of them had disappeared behind a ridge line, leaving Mac alone with his racing thoughts and the impossible memory of first contact. The rest of the drive to Roswell passed in a blur. Mac's mind churned with questions and implications. He was carrying pieces of their craft, evidence of technology so advanced it seemed like magic. But more than that, he was now a witness to their presence on Earth. The weight of that knowledge was almost overwhelming. Sheriff George Wilcox was a good man, Mac knew. Fair-minded and practical, the kind of person who would listen to an unusual story without immediately dismissing it as nonsense. But how do you tell someone that you've just made contact with beings from another world? Mac parked his truck outside the courthouse and sat for a few minutes, gathering his thoughts. Through the blanket-covered windows of the truck bed, the alien fragments continued their gentle pulsing, as if they were alive and aware of their surroundings. Finally, Mac got out of the truck and walked into the sheriff's office. Wilcox looked up from his paperwork and smiled. "How are you doing today, Mac? Haven't seen you in town for a while." Mac cleared his throat. "Sheriff, I found some things on my ranch that I think you should take a look at. Things that, well, they're not like anything I've ever seen before." Wilcox set down his pen and gave Mac his full attention. The rancher's tone was serious, even troubled. In the years they'd known each other, Mac had never been one to waste time on frivolous matters. "What kind of things?" Wilcox asked. Mac walked back to his truck and carefully lifted out one of the wrapped bundles. The metal beam inside was about 3 feet long and seemed to weigh almost nothing. He carried it into the office and set it gently on Wilcox's desk. "Found this and a whole lot more scattered across my south pasture after that big storm the other night," Mac explained as he unwrapped the beam. Wilcox leaned forward to examine the strange artifact. The metal was unlike anything he'd ever seen, seeming to shift between silver and gold depending on the angle of the light. And the symbols along its length were clearly some form of writing, but unlike any alphabet or script in his experience. "What do you think it is?" Wilcox asked, running his finger along the smooth surface. Mac hesitated. He'd planned to tell the sheriff everything, but now that the moment had come, he found himself holding back the most extraordinary part of his story. The beings he'd seen in the desert seemed too fantastic, too impossible to share with anyone else. Instead, he said simply, "I think it might be from some kind of aircraft, but not like any plane I've ever heard of." Wilcox picked up the beam and was amazed by its lightness. The material felt warm to the touch, and the symbols seemed to shimmer slightly as he moved it. This was clearly not ordinary debris from any terrestrial source. "Mac, I think we need to call the Air Force," Wilcox said finally. "This looks like it might be military equipment, and if it is, they're going to want it back." Mac nodded, though part of him was reluctant to involve the military. These artifacts felt too precious, too significant to be locked away in some government warehouse. They deserved to be studied, understood, maybe even returned to their rightful owners. But he also understood that this was bigger than one rancher and one small-town sheriff could handle. Whatever had fallen from the sky was going to require resources and expertise that only the government could provide. Wilcox reached for the phone and dialed the number for Roswell Army Airfield. Within minutes, he was speaking to Major Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer. "Major, this is Sheriff Wilcox. I've got a rancher here with some debris from what might be a plane crash. But the material is, well, it's unlike anything we've seen before. I think you need to take a look at it." Marcel listened to the sheriff's description with growing interest. The 509th Bomb Group had been receiving reports of unusual aircraft in the area for several weeks. Perhaps this debris would finally provide some answers about what was operating in New Mexico's skies. "We'll be right there," Marcel said. As they waited for the military to arrive, Mac and Sheriff Wilcox examined more of the debris. Each piece was a puzzle, exhibiting properties that challenged their understanding of physics and engineering. The memory metal that returned to its original shape, the light-generating fragments that pulsed with their own inner rhythm, the flowing symbols that seemed to tell a story in a language that predated human civilization. But most mysterious of all was the feeling that these artifacts wanted to be understood. There was an intelligence to their design, a purposefulness that suggested they were more than just the random debris from a crashed vehicle. They were messages, Mac realized. Communications from a civilization so advanced that their simplest tools were beyond human comprehension. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the streets of Roswell, carrying with it dust and sage and the promise of change. Soon, military vehicles would arrive to collect the evidence of humanity's first contact with beings from the stars. But for now, in the quiet of the sheriff's office, two men contemplated artifacts that would forever change their understanding of our place in the universe. The sky had opened and let something through, something that had traveled impossible distances to reach this small town in the New Mexico desert. And Mac Brazel, who had started the day as a simple rancher, was now the custodian of humanity's most precious secret. The fragments continued their gentle pulsing, as if they were alive and waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal their true purpose. In the soft light of the sheriff's office, they seemed less like debris from a crashed spacecraft and more like gifts from a civilization that understood humanity wasn't ready for direct contact, but wanted to leave a sign that we weren't alone in the vast cosmos. That sign now rested on Sheriff Wilcox's desk, waiting for the next phase of its journey into human history. Chapter 3. The Intelligence Officer's Dilemma. Major Jesse Marcel adjusted his uniform and checked his watch as he drove through the streets of Roswell toward the courthouse. It was July 7, 1947, and Marcel was about to encounter evidence that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world. As the intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield, Marcel was trained to analyze and identify military equipment from around the globe. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what Sheriff Wilcox was about to show him. The 509th was no ordinary military unit. It was the only atomic bomb group in the world, composed of elite pilots and personnel who had been handpicked for their skills and discretion. Marcel himself was a decorated officer who had served in both the European and Pacific theaters during World War II. He had seen advanced German rockets, Japanese experimental aircraft, and cutting-edge Allied technology. Yet as Marcel parked his Jeep outside the courthouse and walked toward Sheriff Wilcox's office, he had the strange sensation that he was about to step into uncharted territory. Sheriff Wilcox greeted Marcel at the door, his expression a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. "Major, I'm glad you could come so quickly. Wait until you see what Mac found on his ranch." Marcel followed the sheriff into the office, where Mac Brazel stood next to a desk covered with fragments of what appeared to be debris from some kind of aircraft. But as Marcel approached the materials, he realized immediately that this wasn't like any aircraft wreckage he had ever encountered. The first thing that struck him was the lightness of the materials. Marcel picked up a beam that appeared to be about 4 feet long, expecting it to have substantial weight. Instead, it felt like it was made of balsa wood, yet when he tried to flex it, the beam showed no signs of give whatsoever. The metal was extraordinary. It had a dull, pewter-like finish that seemed to shift between silver and gold depending on the angle of the light. More intriguingly, the surface was covered with symbols that looked almost like hieroglyphics, but not quite like any earthly writing system Marcel had ever seen. "What do you make of it, Major?" Sheriff Wilcox asked. Marcel examined the beam more closely, running his fingers along the symbols. They weren't etched or painted onto the surface. They appeared to be an integral part of the material itself, as if they had been formed at a molecular level, and they seemed to have depth, appearing raised from one angle and recessed from another. "I've never seen anything like this," Marcel admitted. "This isn't any kind of military equipment I'm familiar with." Mac Brazel stepped forward. "There's more, Major. A lot more. This is just a small sample of what's scattered across my ranch." Marcel listened as Brazel described the extent of the debris field. 3/4 of a mile long, hundreds of feet wide, covered with materials that exhibited impossible properties. Metal foil that returned to its original shape when crumpled. Beams that were lighter than wood but stronger than steel. Small devices that generated their own light without any visible power source. But it was Brazel's description of the symbols that really captured Marcel's attention. The rancher spoke of markings that seemed to flow along the beams like writing, but writing unlike anything in any human language. The symbols appeared to tell a story, Brazel said, if only someone could understand what they were trying to say. Marcel felt a chill run down his spine. As an intelligence officer, he was familiar with code systems and foreign languages. The German Enigma machine, Japanese diplomatic codes, Soviet cipher systems. But these symbols felt different. They had an organic quality, as if they had grown rather than been designed. "Sheriff, Mr. Brazel," Marcel said carefully, "I'm going to need to see the crash site myself, and I'll need to bring a team to collect all of this material for analysis." Wilcox nodded. "Whatever this is, it's beyond our capabilities here. But Major, there's something else you should know. Mac thinks there might be more to this than just debris from a crashed aircraft." Marcel looked at Brazel, who seemed reluctant to speak. Finally, the rancher cleared his throat. "Major, I saw something else this morning. Something that, well, it sounds crazy, but I think there might have been survivors." Marcel felt his pulse quicken. "Survivors? Are you saying there were people at the crash site?" "Not exactly people," Brazel said quietly, "but beings, small figures, moving around in the desert like they were looking for something. I watched them through binoculars from about 3 miles away." The intelligence officer studied Brazel's face. The rancher was clearly uncomfortable discussing this aspect of his discovery, but he didn't seem to be lying. In Marcel's experience, people who were making up stories usually told them with more confidence and detail. Brazel's hesitation suggested he was struggling to describe something he had actually witnessed but found difficult to believe himself. "Can you describe what you saw?" Marcel asked. Brazel took a deep breath. "They were small, maybe 4 feet tall. Humanoid, but their proportions were different from ours. Larger heads, more slender bodies. Their skin had a metallic quality, almost like it was reflecting light, and they moved gracefully, like they were floating rather than walking." Marcel made mental notes as Brazel spoke. The description was consistent with reports that had been filtering into military intelligence offices for several weeks. Unusual aircraft sightings, radar contacts that didn't behave like conventional aircraft, and occasionally, witness reports of small humanoid figures associated with these phenomena. The 509th had been quietly investigating these reports, but so far they had found no physical evidence to support the more extraordinary claims. Now, sitting in Sheriff Wilcox's office with debris that clearly wasn't of terrestrial origin, Marcel realized that the situation was far more serious than anyone had imagined. "Mr. Brazel," Marcel said, "I need you to guide us to your ranch so we can conduct a thorough investigation of the crash site. And I need both of you to understand that this matter is now classified. You cannot discuss what you've found with anyone else until we determine what we're dealing with." Both men nodded, but Marcel could see the questions in their eyes. Classification was a serious matter, especially in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. But Marcel also knew that if Brazel's description was accurate, they were dealing with something that could have profound implications for national security. The drive to Brazel's ranch took nearly 2 hours along dusty back roads that wound through the high desert landscape. Marcel used the time to radio back to base and arrange for a recovery team to meet them at the site. He was careful not to provide too many details over the radio, but he made it clear that this was a high-priority situation requiring immediate attention. As they approached the debris field, Marcel could see immediately that Brazel hadn't exaggerated the extent of the wreckage. The desert floor was littered with fragments of the strange metallic material, creating a pattern that stretched across the landscape like a silver river. Marcel got out of his jeep and walked slowly among the scattered debris. Each piece he examined reinforced his initial assessment. This wasn't like any terrestrial technology he had ever encountered. The materials exhibited properties that seemed to defy known physics. The craftsmanship was beyond anything achievable with current manufacturing techniques. But it was the overall pattern of the debris field that really captured Marcel's attention. The wreckage wasn't randomly scattered, as would be expected from a violent crash. Instead, it followed a logical progression from larger pieces at one end to smaller fragments at the other, as if the craft had been systematically disassembling itself as it came down. This wasn't the result of an uncontrolled crash, Marcel realized. This was evidence of a controlled descent that had gone wrong at the last moment. As the afternoon wore on, Marcel's recovery team arrived and began the careful process of collecting and cataloging the debris. Each piece was photographed, measured, and carefully packed for transport back to the base. But even as they worked, Marcel found himself studying the desert horizon, looking for signs of the beings that Brazel claimed to have seen. Were they still out there, watching from a distance as humans examined the remains of their technology? Were they injured, stranded on a world far from their home? Or had they somehow managed to repair their craft and continue on their journey to wherever they had been going? As the sun began to set over the New Mexico desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Marcel stood among the scattered debris and contemplated the magnitude of what they had discovered. This wasn't just the remains of an advanced aircraft. This was evidence that humanity was not alone in the universe. The implications were staggering. If beings from other worlds were visiting Earth, it would revolutionize every aspect of human understanding. Science, religion, philosophy, politics, everything would need to be reconsidered in light of this new reality. But Marcel also understood that such a revelation would need to be handled carefully. The world wasn't ready for the truth about what had fallen from the sky into the New Mexico desert. At least, not yet. As his team finished loading the last of the debris into military trucks, Marcel took one final look at the crash site. Tomorrow, there would be briefings, analysis, and difficult decisions about how to handle this extraordinary discovery. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars that suddenly seemed much less empty, Jesse Marcel carried with him the knowledge that humanity had just taken its first step into a larger universe. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. Somewhere among those distant stars were worlds and civilizations beyond human imagination, and somehow one of their emissaries had found its way to a remote ranch in New Mexico, carrying with it gifts that humanity was just beginning to understand. Chapter 4. The Crash Site. Secrets. The morning of July 8th dawned clear and bright over the New Mexico desert, but for Major Jesse Marcel, it felt like the beginning of a day that would change everything. His team had worked through the night, collecting debris from Mac Brazel's ranch and transporting it back to Roswell Army Airfield. Now, as Marcel stood in a secure hangar examining the materials they had recovered, he found himself confronting evidence that challenged every assumption he had ever made about the world. The hangar had been cleared of all non-essential personnel. Only Marcel and a handful of the most trusted officers from the 509th Bomb Group were present as they laid out the debris on examination tables and began their systematic analysis. The first thing that struck Marcel was the sheer volume of material they had collected. The trucks had been loaded with fragments of all sizes, from tiny slivers no bigger than coins to beam sections that were 8 or 10 feet long. Yet despite the quantity, the entire collection weighed less than Marcel would have expected from a conventional aircraft of similar size. Colonel William Blanchard, the base commander, arrived at the hangar shortly after sunrise. Blanchard was a no-nonsense officer who had led bombing missions over Germany during World War II. He was not easily impressed, and he was certainly not given to flights of fancy. But as he examined the debris, Marcel could see the wonder and bewilderment growing in his commander's eyes. "What are we looking at here, Jesse?" Blanchard asked, picking up one of the metallic beams. Marcel shook his head. "I wish I knew, sir. But whatever this is, it's not like anything in our intelligence files." The two officers spent the next hour examining piece after piece of the extraordinary debris. The memory metal was perhaps the most fascinating element. No matter how they crumpled or bent the foil-like material, it would return to its original flat configuration within seconds. There were no stress marks, no signs of fatigue or damage. Even more puzzling were the beam sections with their strange symbols. Under magnification, the markings appeared to have been formed at a molecular level, integrated into the structure of the material itself, rather than etched or stamped onto the surface. The symbols seemed to flow along the beams in patterns that suggested some form of communication. But in a language unlike anything on Earth, Dr. Lincoln LaPaz, a meteor expert from the University of New Mexico, had been quietly brought in to examine the materials. LaPaz was known for his discretion and his scientific rigor. If anyone could provide insight into the nature of these fragments, it would be him. But even LaPaz was baffled by what he found. The materials exhibited properties that were inconsistent with any known terrestrial substances. The metallic components seemed to be composed of elements that didn't match anything in the periodic table. The crystalline structures were impossibly complex, suggesting manufacturing techniques that were centuries ahead of current human capabilities. "Gentlemen," LaPaz said finally, "I can tell you what this isn't, but I cannot tell you what it is. These materials were not created by any known process on Earth." Marcel felt a chill run down his spine. Having his assessment confirmed by an expert of LaPaz's caliber made the situation feel suddenly more real and more serious. They weren't just dealing with unusual debris from some experimental aircraft. They were looking at evidence of technology that originated beyond Earth itself. But the physical debris was only part of the story. Throughout the morning, Marcel had been receiving reports from personnel who had been involved in the recovery operation, and some of those reports were even more extraordinary than the materials themselves. Sergeant Bill Rickett, one of Marcel's most trusted non-commissioned officers, had been part of the team that had conducted a more extensive search of the area beyond Brazel's ranch. What he had found there had shaken him deeply. "Major," Rickett said quietly, "there's something else you need to know about. We found what appears to be the main impact site about 2 miles from where we collected most of the debris." Marcel looked up from the beam fragment he had been examining. "What kind of impact site?" Rickett hesitated. "Sir, there was a large gouge in the desert floor, maybe 30 feet long and 10 feet wide. The sand had been turned to glass from some kind of intense heat, and around the edges of the site we found other things." "Other things?" Marcel prompted. Rickett took a deep breath. "Bodies, sir. 3 of them. Small, humanoid, but clearly not human. They were wearing what appeared to be form-fitting metallic suits, and they had been arranged, like someone had placed them there carefully with respect. The hangar fell silent as the implications of Ricketts' report sank in. Physical debris was one thing, but the recovery of actual beings from another world was something else entirely. This wasn't just a technology issue anymore. This was first contact with an alien civilization. Marcel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. As the intelligence officer for the 509th, he was trained to analyze threats and opportunities. But how do you analyze something that was completely outside human experience? "Where are they now?" Marcel asked. Rickett glanced at Colonel Blanchard, who nodded for him to continue. "We transported them back to the base hospital, sir. Dr. Menzel is examining them, but he's requested additional medical personnel with more specialized knowledge of unusual anatomy." Blanchard stepped forward. "Jesse, I've already been on the phone with Washington. This is now classified at the highest levels. No one talks about this to anyone outside this room without direct authorization from me. Is that understood?" Everyone in the hangar nodded, but Marcel could see the questions in their eyes. These were professional military officers, trained to follow orders and maintain security. But they were also human beings who had just confronted evidence that humanity was not alone in the universe. The psychological impact was enormous. Marcel himself was struggling to process what he was seeing. The debris, the bodies, the implications for human civilization. It was almost too much to comprehend. But there was something else bothering Marcel, something that went beyond the immediate shock of the discovery. The crash site that Rickett had described didn't sound like the result of an accident. The careful arrangement of the bodies, the way the debris had been scattered in such an orderly pattern, the controlled nature of what Brazel had witnessed descending from the sky. This wasn't a crash, Marcel realized. This was something else entirely. Major, what if they didn't crash? Marcel turned to find Captain Dan Hamill, one of the base's engineering officers, examining a section of what appeared to be hull material. What if this was intentional? "What do you mean?" Marcel asked. Hamill held up the fragment he had been studying. "Look at the way this material failed. There are no stress fractures, no signs of violent impact. The edges are clean, almost surgical. This looks more like controlled disassembly than crash damage." Marcel studied the piece that Hamill was holding. The engineering officer was right. The fragment looked like it had been carefully separated from a larger structure, not torn away in a violent crash. The implications were staggering. If the craft hadn't crashed, if it had instead been deliberately taken apart, that suggested the occupants had made a conscious decision to abandon their vessel. But why? And what had happened to the rest of the crew? "These 3 bodies at the impact site," Marcel said to Rickett. "Were there any signs of others?" Rickett shook his head. "Just the 3, sir. But there were indications that the site had been disturbed after the initial impact. Footprints around the perimeter, all the same size and pattern, as if other members of the crew had been there but had left before we arrived." Marcel felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to come together in his mind. A craft from another world had come down in the New Mexico desert. Most of the crew had survived and had systematically disassembled their vessel, scattering the pieces across the landscape. 3 of their number had died, and the survivors had honored them with a careful burial arrangement before departing for an unknown destination. But departed how, and where had they gone? Chapter 5. The Vanishing Survivors. The questions were endless, and answers felt just beyond reach. Major Jesse Marcel carried them with him like the weight of the desert sky itself. The wreckage was extraordinary, the symbols etched into the fragments haunting in their strangeness, the bodies too fragile, too alien to belong to Earth. But beyond the debris and beyond the remains was something more troubling: the possibility that not everything had been recovered. When dawn broke over the desert on July 7th, the soldiers combing the plains and ravines began whispering among themselves. Some swore they had found impressions in the sand, not boot prints, not animal tracks, but small indentations like elongated feet, arranged in pairs, vanishing into the sagebrush. Others reported hearing faint sounds in the night. It was not the cry of coyotes or the distant rumble of thunder. It was a vibration, low and steady, that seemed to hum within their rib cages. The desert had always been a place of silence. Yet now, silence itself seemed alive, charged, as though listening. Marcel stood at the edge of the debris field once more, binoculars raised. The horizon shimmered with heat, even in the early hours, and dust swirled in restless gusts. He scanned the arroyos and the ridgelines, half expecting to see movement. A flicker of light, a shadow ducking behind a rock. Nothing. Only the endless New Mexico landscape, unblinking and ancient. But he felt it. The sensation that the recovery team was not alone. The men who brought reports of strange tracks were told to keep quiet. Their officers insisted the marks were tricks of wind and erosion. Yet the men could not shake the feeling that something had slipped away during the night, that the desert itself had swallowed what remained of the crash survivors. That evening, a patrol returned from the foothills of the Capitan Mountains. Their faces were pale, their voices unsteady. They told Marcel they had heard it again, that strange harmonic vibration, rising from the rocks as though the earth itself were singing. One soldier, a farm boy from Kansas, said it was like standing too close to a church organ when it held a deep note. You didn't hear it as much as feel it. When the men reached the source, there was nothing. No machine, no body, not even debris. Just silence, broken only by the rustle of desert grass in a wind that hadn't been there moments before. They had searched the area for signs of life. A few bushes were crushed, stones displaced, but the trail ended in nothingness. It was as though whatever they pursued had simply vanished. Marcel took the report in silence. He wanted to dismiss it, to attribute it to nerves or imagination, but he could not. The men were not liars, and fear had etched itself too clearly across their faces. As night fell, Marcel lingered outside the command tent. The desert stretched endlessly, a black ocean under the glitter of the Milky Way. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills and dunes, might be survivors. Injured, perhaps, but alive. Intelligent beings, hiding in the shadows while the army scrambled to erase their presence from history. The thought gnawed at him. The crash might not be the end of a story, but the beginning of one. In the town of Roswell, people had begun to talk. Mac Brazel, against his better judgment, had mentioned to neighbors that he had found wreckage unlike anything he had ever seen. Word spread quickly, twisting and growing in the telling. Some said he had discovered a downed aircraft. Others whispered of a disk fallen from the stars. Children gathered in alleyways, repeating rumors like ghost stories, their eyes wide with wonder and fear. At the barber shop, men speculated in low voices. At the diner, waitresses leaned in close to ranchers, asking questions no one could answer. And at the airfield, journalists began sniffing around, sensing something unusual in the desert air. Meanwhile, the army tightened its grip. Roadblocks were set up on dirt tracks. Soldiers stood watch at ranches, their rifles slung casually but their eyes sharp. Anyone who wandered too close to the crash site was warned away. Brazel himself was questioned repeatedly, then escorted into town under guard. The story was becoming too large to contain, too volatile to control. But even as the army focused on keeping people out, Marcel worried about what might already be beyond their reach. Survivors. Beings unaccounted for. Creatures who might still be moving across the desert night, unseen, unheard, but present. On July 9th, the search expanded. Helicopters thumped across the sky, their spotlights cutting white cones into the dusk. Jeeps rolled out across the plains in long convoys, dust trailing behind like banners. Teams swept arroyos with floodlamps, their beams crossing over tumbleweeds and rocks, chasing shadows that vanished before they could be caught. The men were tense. A few whispered that they hoped nothing else was found. Others admitted they prayed they wouldn't stumble upon one of the beings still breathing. None could imagine what would happen if they did. That night, Private Williams stood watch on the edge of the debris field. The stars were sharp above him, the desert silent. Suddenly, he felt it, that vibration in his bones, the one others had spoken of. His skin prickled. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon. At first he saw nothing, then, faintly, a shimmer, as though heat waves were rising from the ground, though the air was cool. He blinked, the shimmer shifted, moved, then vanished. Williams reported the incident to his superior, but by morning the story had already been filed away as imagination. No one wanted more questions. For Marcel, the unease only grew. Each report of strange lights, each story of a hum in the earth, added to the mounting sense that the army was not chasing wreckage, but running from something greater. The beings were not accounted for. Were they hiding in caves? Had they slipped away under cover of night? Or were they, impossibly oddly, still near, cloaked in ways no human eye could detect? Marcel wondered if the desert was more than a landscape. Perhaps it was a veil, a place where the edges of worlds brushed against one another. If beings had survived, maybe they had not fled across the desert floor at all. Maybe they had simply stepped somewhere else. The soldiers never found them. Patrols returned empty. Tracks vanished. Vibrations faded. The lights in the distance were dismissed as stars or lanterns or imagination. Yet the stories lingered. Men spoke of feeling watched, of sensing presence where no presence could be, of waking in the night certain that something stood just outside their tent, only to find nothing but wind when they pulled back the flap. And in the hearts of those who had seen the bodies, who had touched the strange materials, who had glimpsed symbols no human hand had drawn, one truth gnawed like hunger. If there had been survivors, they were no longer captives of the desert. They had slipped the net. They had vanished. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were still here, watching, waiting. The desert no longer felt like empty land. It felt inhabited by something unseen, something patient, something not finished. Chapter 6. The Official Story. The desert could keep secrets, but men could not. In Roswell, the story of what had been found on the ranch was already spreading faster than the army could suppress it. By July 8th, the situation had become precarious. Reporters had caught wind of rumors. Radio stations whispered about strange wreckage. Neighbors swapped stories in hushed tones at fences and feed stores. The silence that the army tried to enforce only seemed to confirm suspicions that something extraordinary had happened. The commanding officers at Roswell Army Airfield understood that the truth, whatever it was, could not be allowed to grow wild. It needed pruning, shaping, controlling. And so, they devised a story neat enough, familiar enough, to calm the public and redirect their gaze back to earthly matters. The official narrative would not be one of mystery, but of error. Not a crash from the stars, but the misidentification of something ordinary, a weather balloon. On the morning of July 8th, the Public Information Office at Roswell prepared a press release. Major Jesse Marcel, who had been so deeply involved in the recovery of the wreckage, was ordered to participate. The release would state that the Army had recovered the remains of a flying disc, but the language was slippery, vague enough to be reinterpreted. Within hours, newspapers across the country seized upon the phrase, "RAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region," read the headlines. The story ignited like dry grass in summer wind. Phones rang off the hook. Editors scrambled. The idea of a disc, of visitors from beyond Earth, was too tantalizing to ignore. But behind the walls of the airfield, a second release was already being prepared. The Army had no intention of letting the narrative spin beyond their control. By evening, Brigadier General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth held a press conference. He posed for photographs, standing over the scattered remains of what he declared to be nothing more than a weather balloon. Marcel was present, his face composed, but his spirit burning with conflict. The debris laid out before the press bore little resemblance to what he had carried from Brazel's ranch. The strange, unbreakable materials, the beams etched with symbols, they were nowhere in sight. Instead, a tangle of foil, sticks, and rubber lay across the floor, pitifully mundane. The general explained with calm authority that the flying disc had been mistaken, that what had seemed extraordinary was, in truth, ordinary. His words carried the full weight of the United States Army. For many, that was enough. For others, the explanation rang hollow. In Roswell, Mac Brazel found himself at the center of attention. He had been the one to discover the debris, and now reporters wanted every detail. But Brazel's story shifted, reshaped under pressure. He told of rubber strips, of tin foil and sticks, materials unremarkable, hardly worth a headline. He admitted sheepishly that he had been mistaken. What he did not say, what perhaps he no longer dared to say, was that the first debris he had touched had not been so fragile, so ordinary. Neighbors remembered his first account, spoken before the soldiers had arrived, when his voice had carried awe and fear. Now that awe was gone, replaced by a cautious weariness. Brazel withdrew from the spotlight soon after. Those who knew him best said he seemed changed, quieter, more guarded, a man who had been warned into silence. For Marcel, the charade was unbearable. He had seen with his own eyes the strangeness of the wreckage. He had held it in his hands, bent it, twisted it, watched it return to its shape without crease or scar. He had studied the symbols etched into the beams, symbols no man of science had ever recorded. To stand before the press now, to nod as superiors spoke of balloons, was a betrayal of the truth. But orders were orders. The army demanded silence, and silence was what he gave. At home, though, Marcel's composure cracked. His wife watched him pace the living room, restless, agitated. He showed fragments of the material to his son, hoping the boy's young eyes might remember what the world was told to forget. But the fragments, too, vanished soon after, collected, catalogued, hidden away. The official story swallowed everything. The press conference in Fort Worth achieved its purpose. Newspapers that had shouted "flying disc" on the front page now printed retractions and clarifications. The saucer had been explained, identified, dismissed. What had begun as the greatest story of the century ended, in the span of 24 hours, as a curiosity barely worth a column inch. Across the country, readers turned the page. The world moved on, but not everyone. In Roswell, the townspeople who had glimpsed the commotion at the airfield, who had spoken to soldiers returning from the desert, who had heard the first unguarded words from Brazel and others, remembered. They remembered how quickly the story had changed. They remembered the unease in the soldiers' eyes. They remembered the way the desert felt heavier, as though carrying a secret. Some accepted the balloon explanation, others did not. And in the shadows of their doubt, legend began to root itself. The army pressed forward, determined to smother every ember of speculation. Files were sealed. Wreckage was transported under cover of night to facilities far from curious eyes. Men were told in no uncertain terms that silence was their duty. At the crash site, the desert was swept clean. No trace remained of the extraordinary. To a passerby, the land looked untouched, as though nothing had ever fallen from the sky. But the silence of the desert was deceptive. Beneath it, the questions remained, gnawing at the edges of men's minds. Why had the army reacted with such urgency to a balloon? Why had witnesses spoken of bodies before the story shifted? Why did the air still hum, faint and low, when the wind died at night? The official story was simple, elegant, and false, and like all falsehoods, it demanded vigilance to maintain. In the weeks that followed, life in Roswell returned, at least outwardly, to its rhythms. Cattle were tended, children played in dusty yards, planes lifted from the airfield with their usual thunder. Yet the town carried an unspoken memory, a collective awareness that something extraordinary had brushed against the fabric of their days. The army believed it had buried the truth. But truth, like desert seeds, has a way of lying dormant until the rains come. Chapter 7. The Doctors. The desert kept its silence, but in the corridors of the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital, silence was not so easily won. Doctors had been summoned quietly, some from the base itself, others from farther afield. They arrived under escort, their names recorded, their tongues bound by orders they could not refuse. Each was told little, only that their expertise was required for an unusual matter. In the cool sterility of the hospital's restricted ward, the air was heavy with disinfectant and secrecy. The windows were covered, the doors guarded. Nurses whispered as they carried trays, their eyes wide with questions they dared not ask. The doctors waited, uncertain, their white coats a fragile armor against whatever was about to be revealed. Then the stretchers arrived. The sheets concealed most of what lay beneath, but not enough. Shapes too small, too slight to be men. Limbs narrow, delicate, heads that seemed large against their frail bodies. The smell that accompanied them was faint, metallic, and wrong, like hot wires and burned ozone. When the sheets were drawn back, silence fell like a shroud. The figures were not human. Their skin, gray and smooth, stretched taut over fine bones. Their eyes, those that remained open, were black pools without iris or white, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Their hands bore long fingers, jointed differently than human ones, the nails thin and translucent. Some were broken, twisted by the violence of impact. Others were intact, preserved in eerie stillness. The doctors stared, each man reaching instinctively for the rational, the earthly. Deformities, experimental test subjects, a cruel hoax. Yet the longer they looked, the further such explanations slipped from reach. Here, in the quiet of a military hospital, lay beings that belonged nowhere in the catalog of earthly life. Autopsies were ordered. Reluctantly, hesitantly, the doctors complied. Scalpels slid against skin that resisted at first, then parted with a texture unlike anything known. The tissues beneath were pale, fibrous, strangely uniform. Blood, or something like it, was present, though darker, thicker, slower to move. The organs were both familiar and alien, a heart, but with chambers arranged unlike any human's, lungs, but spongier, branching with strange efficiency. The skulls, when opened, revealed brains dense with convolutions, their structures both familiar and foreign. Instruments recorded measurements, photographs were taken, notes dictated in hushed voices. Every observation was logged, yet none of it brought understanding. The work unsettled even the most seasoned physicians. These were not cadavers of soldiers or civilians. They were visitors from elsewhere, beings whose lives had been cut short in violent descent. The doctors could not escape the sense that they were trespassing. Some whispered prayers as they worked. Others kept their silence, letting only the scratching of pens and the click of cameras mark the hours. Outside the ward, the military's presence thickened. Guards at the doors, officers pacing the hallways, typewriters clattering as reports were compiled and locked away. Each doctor was called aside, one by one, and made to sign papers that bound their silence more tightly than any professional oath. What you saw does not leave this room. What you touched does not exist. What you know, you must forget. The weight of those words pressed heavily. Lives, reputations, families, all could be undone by disobedience. The army made certain of it. And so, though the doctors had seen what no human eyes had ever seen before, they spoke of it to no one. Not to their colleagues, not to their wives, not even to themselves in the safety of thought. The experience was sealed away, hidden deeper than memory, until only fragments remained in restless dreams. One nurse, younger than most, struggled with what she had witnessed. She had stood by the trays, handed instruments, wiped sweat from the brows of men who no longer believed in their own science. She had seen the black eyes stare lifelessly, yet felt certain that once they had held knowledge greater than hers. In the quiet of her quarters she wept, not for fear of punishment, but for grief. Whatever these beings were, they had traveled farther than any human could imagine. They had crossed the void between stars, only to die in the dirt of a foreign desert. She lit a candle for them, whispering a prayer without knowing what gods might hear. Her candle burned low, unseen by the officers who enforced silence, unnoticed by the desert night. But in that flame lived the only gesture of mourning those visitors would receive on Earth. Rumors leaked despite the Army's efforts. A janitor caught a glimpse through a half-open door. A clerk overheard phrases not meant for him. Stories trickled into town, distorted, fragmented, yet persistent. Talk of small bodies, of doctors sworn to secrecy, of things not of this world. The army countered with denial. No such bodies existed, they said. No such examinations had taken place. Any rumors were the product of imagination, of hysteria, of the fevered minds of those who longed for wonder. But denial did not erase the truth. The doctors carried it within them, silent but indelible. They lived their lives, tended their patients, raised their children. Yet on sleepless nights, when the world was still, they remembered the gray skin beneath their hands, the dark eyes staring upward, the silence of beings who had crossed eternity only to be dissected on a table far from home. In the desert, the crash site had been cleared, swept of every trace, but in the hospital morgue, locked deep within guarded rooms, the remains lay preserved. Jars held samples of tissue, boxes held bones, containers sealed away what no human had ever studied before. Scientists whispered of transfer orders, of shipments to facilities far from New Mexico. Some spoke of Wright Field in Ohio, where secrets of aviation were kept. Others of underground labs whose names never reached paper. Wherever they went, the beings vanished into the labyrinth of military secrecy, never to surface again. The doctors, bound to silence, aged with their memories. Some took them to the grave, never speaking. Others confided only in whispers, late in life, when the weight of years weakened the fear of punishment. Their accounts, scattered and uncertain, would one day feed the flames of legend. But in 1947, in the quiet corridors of Roswell's hospital, legend was not yet born. Only silence, only fear, only the lingering sense that humanity had brushed against something vast and incomprehensible. The desert kept its silence, the doctors kept theirs, and the truth waited, hidden in jars and files and haunted hearts. Chapter 8. The Cover-Up. The desert had returned to its usual silence. But behind the walls of the military bases, behind the curtained windows of the hospital, and behind the closed doors of Roswell Army Airfield, a storm was gathering, one far more complex than any thundercloud that had passed over the ranch weeks before. The events of July 1947 had left indelible impressions on everyone involved. Major Jesse Marcel had seen and handled things no human was meant to comprehend. Mac Brazel had stumbled upon fragments of another world. The doctors had touched life forms that came from the stars. And yet, the public knew nothing. The official story, a weather balloon misidentified, had taken hold, simple and tidy, a narrative designed to quiet questions rather than answer them. But controlling the narrative was never simple. In the dim light of a secure office at Fort Worth, Brigadier General Roger Ramey convened a meeting. Present were Marcel, Colonel Blanchard, intelligence officers, and a handful of medical personnel. Maps of the desert were spread across the table, photographs of the debris and diagrams of the humanoids meticulously labeled and stacked. Every document bore the mark, top secret, eyes only. "Gentlemen," Ramey said, "we need to ensure the public never knows what really happened at Roswell. Not now, not ever. If word spreads that extraterrestrial beings have visited Earth, the ramifications are unthinkable." Marcel's jaw tightened. "Sir, the people in Roswell already saw the debris. They saw the bodies. The press." Ramey's hand cut through the air. "I am aware of that, and that is precisely why we must act. You will follow orders. We will control every narrative, manipulate every photograph, and ensure that anyone who has seen more than they should will either fall silent or be discredited." The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the tension of men who knew that history itself was being shaped by a lie. Marcel left that meeting with a knot in his stomach. He had handled top-secret materials before, but nothing like this. Nothing that could challenge the foundation of human understanding so completely. The memory of the gray-skinned bodies and the strange pulsing debris weighed on him. But the Army had made one thing clear. Their mission was secrecy, not understanding. Over the next days, the recovery of the wreckage continued. Every piece, from the smallest light-emitting fragment to the largest memory metal beam, was transported under armed escort to hidden locations. Some went to Wright Field in Ohio, others to storage facilities that even Marcel would never see. All traces of the extraordinary debris were removed from the public eye. The crash site itself was altered. Bulldozers leveled the land, covering depressions and gouges. New sand was spread to hide the scorch marks, footprints erased, the landscape restored to a desert emptiness that suggested nothing had ever fallen there. Yet even in its erasure, the desert remembered. Beneath the surface, the imprint of the event remained, like a wound that never fully heals. The medical specimens followed the same careful, guarded path. The humanoid bodies were transported with extreme care, catalogued under code numbers and stored in cold rooms far from civilian eyes. Tissues, organs, and skulls were divided into containers, each sealed and labeled with precision. Only personnel with the highest clearance could access them. The doctors involved were instructed to alter their reports, to remove all references to extraterrestrial origin. Their notes were rewritten to suggest anomalies in anatomy that could be explained away as deformities, rare genetic conditions, or experimental human subjects. Many of them were haunted by the act, the knowledge that truth had been hidden behind bureaucratic walls and forged documentation. Some tried to keep secret diaries. Some whispered the truth to trusted family members, only to realize that memory alone could be coerced, edited, erased under fear of reprisal. The weight of silence became a second skin, binding them to an understanding the world would never share. In Roswell, the town moved on with uneasy normality. Ranchers returned to their fields. Children went back to school. Reporters moved on to more sensational but less disruptive stories. The flying disc was gone from headlines, replaced by ordinary events, politics, weather, the mundane rhythms of American life. Yet whispers persisted. Stories passed from person to person, distorted, exaggerated, but rooted in truth. A neighbor remembered a metallic sheen in the desert. A ranch hand recalled seeing small figures move with unnatural grace. The fragments that had been shown briefly before removal haunted the memories of those who had touched them. And for Major Marcel, every day was a quiet battle. He carried with him a secret larger than any man should bear alone. He held in his mind the shape of alien eyes, the patterns of symbols, the impossible properties of materials that defied physics. Each time he recounted the official story publicly, he felt the lie like a weight pressing against his chest. The military's efforts extended beyond Roswell. Every piece of the puzzle that could hint at extraterrestrial origin was gathered, transported, catalogued, and hidden. Engineers, scientists, and military officers were sworn to secrecy. Media reports were monitored, stories corrected, dissenting witnesses pressured to conform. Those who balked faced career-ending consequences or reassignment to obscurity. And yet the truth leaked in fragments. Soldiers who had seen the bodies whispered among themselves. Airmen who had handled debris hinted at properties they could not describe. Though these whispers were muted, they were enough to create a network of rumor that would last decades. In that network, the seeds of what would later be called the Roswell incident took root. The cover-up was complete, but not absolute. Truth, though buried, survived in shadows, in hushed conversations, in forgotten diaries, in dreams that could not be silenced. Marcel often thought of Mac Brazel during those years. The simple rancher had seen the arrival firsthand, had touched materials that Marcel himself would never hold again. He had glimpsed the beings, small and alien, and yet, in their presence, had understood a connection that transcended words. Mac's life continued quietly. He tended sheep and cattle, spoke little of the events of July, and carried with him a quiet knowledge that the world would never acknowledge. Occasionally Marcel would wonder if the rancher's memory was as vivid as his own, if he too dreamt of the desert, the glowing fragments, and the small black-eyed beings who had walked among the sand. Some nights, Marcel imagined the desert stretching out endlessly under a starlit sky. He imagined the beings looking up from wherever they had gone, seeing the earth in its turmoil, and wondering whether the species they had visited was ready for contact. He wondered if they had left messages behind, coded in ways humanity could not yet perceive, waiting for a moment when comprehension might be possible. Time passed. The Army maintained secrecy with relentless determination. Documents were classified, archives sealed, files marked top secret alien materials. Researchers were directed toward mundane tasks. Histories were rewritten, statements were altered. The official story, a weather balloon, nothing more, became gospel truth in the public sphere. And yet, despite decades of effort, anomalies persisted. The whispers, the scattered reports, the dreams of those who had touched the materials, the impossible memories of symbols that shifted under the eye, they could not be entirely suppressed. The cover-up was meticulous, deliberate, and total. But secrecy is never complete. Even today, in the New Mexico desert, the sand remembers. The wind whispers over the empty plains, carrying fragments of truth in subtle currents. And though no one sees them, the pulses of light from another world, however faint, continue to echo somewhere beyond the reach of human perception. History, as it is recorded, tells one story, but the truth, the story that began with a summer storm, a rancher, an intelligence officer, and 3 beings from the stars, is far stranger. It is a story of contact, of wonder, of secrecy, and of the fragile human attempts to contain what cannot be contained. And it began quietly in the New Mexico desert, in the summer of 1947, when the sky opened and let something extraordinary fall to earth. The desert remains, silent and eternal. The stars remain, distant and indifferent. But the memory of what happened, and what was hidden, lingers, waiting for the day when humanity might finally understand the gift that fell into the sand and the hearts of a few who dared to witness it.